What I'm sharing with you today has largely emerged from my research stream called the Social Studies and History Education in the Anthropocene Network, or SHEAN as we call it. And I want to express thanks for the federal funding that we've received to do so much of this work that I'll be sharing today. And almost all of it is available on my website, and thanks to Canada's History for making those links available for everyone in the chat. We'll be sharing a couple of different links throughout. So if the word or term Anthropocene is new to you, it's an increasingly common concept that came out of geology to describe the impact that humans are having on our planet, which has been so significant as to warrant the naming of a new geological epoch. And the term remains controversial with some, and I certainly invite critical engagement with it. But I think what's important about it as a representation or periodization is that we are facing unparalleled geologic level change in a really short period of time. And we really need to take that seriously in everything that we do. I want to assure you that if at some point it feels like I'm getting off track in this presentation, I have 3 recommendations that I'll be making to history teachers and everyone who's joining us today. The first is the value of exploring and emphasizing continuities, not just change over time. The necessity of getting history classes outside, and the opportunity for history education to engage with pre-existing environmental communities, or what I'm going to explain as uncovering the mycelial network. So I care so much about this topic, about history and the environment, and I'm so excited to see the field receiving this attention from Canada's history and from everyone who's watching today. This slide shows all of the places in Canada that I've lived and learned and that have contributed to my interests, where I've been also supported by formative educational and academic communities. And I wish I could take the time to name all of my teachers and elders and scholar mentors. But with limited time, I'll sum up the slide by saying that I was academically trained as a historian in environmental history and then educational history. And I did a PhD in Indigenous education and history education. I worked for the Nunavut government, the Department of Education, for a time on policy and curricular initiatives related to decolonizing schools. But what I want to say about this slide, more than the details of my life, is that regardless of your formal education or your professional training, regardless of whether your relationship with history and with the environment is new or very old, you really do have something to bring to this work. Even if you haven't always seen yourself as an environmental activist, there's space for you. Anyone, whether they're in grade 2 or grade 12 or a graduate degree program or are a teacher, can begin by writing or rewriting your own environmental biography, writing the story of who you are in relationship to the land, and maybe who your family has been in relationship to the land over time, or multiple lands over time. And not to mention the ice and the water and the land species and the water species and the birds and the plants that we rely on. They can all show up in our stories too. And I think when we engage in work that feels very uncertain, or it feels like it demands that we change, which environmental work often does, and I think it should, if we can shore up a little bit more of who we are, what we love, the places and the species that have been so meaningful to us, it doesn't feel as scary. So I believe that environmental teaching should begin by better connecting with what we love, not with the fear of losing something, not with the fear of loss. Grief, of course, accompanies climate change for many people, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. And there has to be space in our teaching, I think, for grief and for a spectrum of other emotions that come along, like gratitude and awe. We love to talk about awe in my class in relation to nature, and anger too, right? But I've learned that we can gently reframe some of those emotions to ones that actually feed the action that's necessary, such as a desire for connection, right? We can reframe grief as love, as care, as a source of meaning for the work that we need to do. So despite feeling so supported by many educational communities across Canada over the years, as I just said, in 2015, I felt very uncertain about my future in the field of history and history education. And in that summer, I went on an Arctic trip that took me to the 78th parallel, which is as close to the North Pole as I probably will ever get. And the summer that August was stunning. It was sunny and warm, and it was one of those moments where you're like, wait, it's not supposed to be so easy to get through the Northwest Passage. That's what history tells us, right? But we did. We sailed right through. I was on an educational cruise with science experts and Indigenous knowledge experts, and we were learning about climate change and polar ice melt and impacts on wildlife and permafrost pattern changes. And I looked around and I suddenly felt like there's nothing more important than work that directly addresses the frayed and fraying relationship between humans and the ecosystems on which we are dependent. This felt urgent for me because I grew up in the Arctic. And as mentioned, I spent time, well, I was born on Yellowknives Dene territory into a settler family. And I grew up most of my young life in Iqaluit Nunavut on Inuit territory and continued to spend parts of my life there and to work in Nunavut for a time. But despite that life experience, I hadn't really taken climate change to heart the way until I did that day in Greenland. And when I had this realization, it came with a conviction that perhaps leaving history behind for a career in environmental conservation would be better aligned with my values. And it felt scary and discouraging to think of starting all over right after I'd finished a PhD in history education. So instead, I began to ask, how can I bring my connections and my expertise and my relationships and my work from history and history education into future climate response work? So my subsequent study, my reading and my thinking that happened after that time, I can't sum up. I know there's a lot of text on this slide and I won't go through all of it, but I do want to make really specific mention of these three texts that I think are important. The first is Silawa Cloutier's book, The Right to be Cold, which defends the importance of studying the past as providing value and in its historical context for understanding and problematizing the injustice and the inequity and disproportionate consequences of climate change being experienced by Inuit in the Arctic and by other Indigenous peoples, indeed, as Tanya said earlier, and by other populations who did not contribute significantly to the causes of climate change. Secondly, hopefully some of you are familiar with Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope. This text is showing how an Indigenous tribal leader of the Crow Nation named Plentiku used traditional concepts to support his people to survive in the face of cultural devastation during colonization. We too, I think, can consider what it means to bring the past with us into the future when the very terms within which meaning is constructed might be being lost, might feel like they're slipping away. And third, Roy Scranton's text, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, which of course has a quite provocative title. I met Roy on the trip that I mentioned through the Arctic and learned from him, and he defends the important role of the humanities, generally speaking, and I'll include history in that, in preserving and engaging with human wisdom and knowledge, even through the crumbling of a civilization predicated on capitalism and extractivism. So coming back to that grief, as I read and talked more with my colleagues about the work that we needed to do in history, I never left behind that grief that manifested on my beautiful summer trip in the high Arctic. And so I've been on a long journey, academic journey, pedagogical journey, and personal journey, learning about eco-anxiety. And although I won't take a lot of time to talk about it today, I want to signal how important I think it is for teachers and organizational leaders in other spaces to be aware of how emotions can both tamper with, but also feed and support the kind of environmental activism that we need. It can energize it. Of course, history teachers are not new to sharing difficult knowledge and difficult histories with young people. And so I think history teachers actually have a lot to contribute to this challenge. So in addition to the resource produced by my organization, SSHEAN, that's mentioned here, I also have 2 texts that I suggest if you want to read up more on this topic. Sarah Jacquette Ray's work is really important. But in terms of our own resources that we've been developing for classrooms, I want to explain that, we've found that teachers like lesson plans that are ready to go and that offer them everything they need. And so we've been working on creating such resources. We often use the approach of creating critical challenges, much like the Critical Thinking Consortium's approach to lesson planning. And we use a critical thinking question. We provide key vocabulary, criteria, and thinking strategies, and primary sources for the lessons. We design them so that they're kind of standalone lessons. Teachers don't have to do or provide a lot of background information, and the historical thinking concepts are explicit in the lessons. They can also easily be modified for different levels, both early years to grade 12 and post-secondary education. One lesson has students contribute to ongoing debates among scientists and other researchers over the question, when did the Anthropocene begin? So students work in groups to learn more about this authentic debate, about the dates that have been suggested for the marker of the beginning of the Anthropocene, including the beginning of colonization or associated with industrialization or the nuclear age and others. In groups, students consider a variety of criteria for this and develop a persuasive argument about when the Anthropocene began. Another lesson we have is based on the documentary film by Alethea Arnachak-Burrill called Angry Inuk. Students see how the Inuit seal hunt is not cruel or problematic as it has been depicted by conservation organizations and celebrities, but rather a culturally, ecologically, and economically sustaining practice for Inuit communities. The activities in this lesson have students identify evidence of Inuit perspectives on seal hunting and compare the volume of voices of different historical actors over time. Students discuss whose perspectives should be considered when developing environmental policies. And we have lessons on themes related to war. As many of you probably know, senior science in high school often focuses on the 20th century, and the war plays a big part in that content. And so we saw the opportunity to engage in climate content there. And I want to thank my colleagues, Sarah Karn at McMaster and Alex Sushin at Guelph for writing these lessons and piloting them. And I hope you check them out and make use of them. At Queen's University, I teach student teachers environmental education. And through curating experiential learning for student teachers, I've shifted my priorities so greatly over the years, moving beyond a content focus. Because I think our environmental challenges are not so much problems of information, but of relationship and of vulnerability. So I'm continuously shifting my pedagogy to account for how vulnerable humans feel, not just in the face of threatening environmental conditions, but also, as we all are probably experiencing recently, increasingly inhospitable social conditions and the absence of cultural practices that connect us to ourselves. Our device always gets in the way of us connecting to ourselves, connecting to each other in community and belonging, and to the earth. And so these are the kinds of questions that I work now with in my teaching. How do you love the earth, and how does the earth love you? What makes you feel ready to change with the earth in mind? And as you move into an uncertain future, what will you bring with you from the past? So you're probably beginning to see the influences I've already talked about today, but shifting eco-anxiety towards a focus on relationship and love and care, shifting a sense of burden associated with being told our individual obligations to, focus on climate action, shifting that towards curating action that feels good to us in collectivities and communities, action by choice. and shifting towards narratives in which continuity is viable, like certain types of continuity, right? Our memory, our traditions, our practices and values that serve us. And while recognizing certainly that there are many things that we do need to let decay in the process of climate, a just climate transition. So colleagues and I have used these questions in arts-based activities, less history-focused, more arts-based activities, which you can find out more about on my website if you're interested. Okay, as promised, I've come to my 3 recommendations for history and environment, bringing them together. So the first is that we can experience a sense of continuity in the context of great, overwhelming, and out of control change, frankly. I think if we can write ourselves into the world, into the connection between the past and present and future. And so I think it's important that youth be invited to do that for themselves, to write their own narrative about what climate change means, about what environmental relationality means, to allow them to have their own encounters with the more than human, to allow them to witness for themselves the intersection of social and ecological oppressions, to invite them to listen to multiple perspectives. Youth can be supported, again, to write themselves into history and into place. What I mean by learning a learning ethic or a chickadee virtue is again influenced by Jonathan Lear in his text Radical Hope. He reminds us that human societies in the past have faced and traversed devastation. For example, Kyle White, a Potawatomi scholar, has said Indigenous peoples have already been through an apocalypse. And there's wisdom that they've brought from that. So as Jonathan Lear explains, when the Crow Nation experienced such dramatic dispossession by the American state during colonization, their leader turned to the guidance of a chickadee figure who appeared to him. And the chickadee virtue is, quote, if one listens and learns from others in the right way, even in radically different circumstances, even with the collapse of one's world, something good will come of it. So it really is a learning ethic. And I think if we look to the past as something that we need to improve upon or progress out of, then we may be disappointed. But the purpose of looking to the past, not to offer a yardstick by which to measure our betterment, but to give us resources in creating meaning in the face of whatever conditions arise, whether they're expected, whether they're what we expected or not, I think has potential. As has been mentioned this evening already, and I also think of Dwayne Donald, a Cree scholar from Edmonton, who teaches that we have been taught in schools to forget that people have lived well in other ways than what we see right now, than the status quo we see so dominant in our society now. And he turns to Blackfoot story and Cree knowledges as a tonic to this problem and as guidance on other ways to live a good life. And I think we should not take those knowledges for granted as we determine what is ethical to sustain and what is ethical to let decay. So my second recommendation is getting classes outside, and research demonstrates the positive health outcomes of living and learning in green spaces for child development and for humans in general. It's so well demonstrated that we can develop the strong ecological relationships that will inform responsive and smart and flexible climate action if we really understand the ecosystems with which we're a part. And those relationships can also feed the love that we need to energize the action we need to take. And so I think every moment outside is important and potentially often more important than the moments we spend inside. So rather than viewing outdoor and environmental education as taking away time that would otherwise be spent on traditional subjects, I think we need to look to those subjects like history to get kids outside and to see how we can learn alongside other species. And I know there's objections and barriers that limit teachers' opportunities to take youth outside in public schools anyway. But I do think that history teachers can do this more often than they do now. Furthermore, Indigenous land-based learning, as we've heard about, and mentorship are among the most important strategies for facilitating so many important things right now. Indigenous language revitalization, cultural revitalization, decolonization, protection for biodiversity, land defense, water protection, all things that Tanya spoke about this evening, the place where we can reflect and develop a holistic perspective. These potential learning outcomes are so important both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And they relate, in my opinion, as much to history as they do to other subject areas. So I've included on the slide a number of suggestions of topics and experiences, such as questioning place naming practices, including the languages that we use in place names, the languages we use to describe the land, the metaphors we use associated with place. While instead we could consider, the Indigenous place names and the orientation and the worldview within which those names arose. Such lessons could be taught just as powerfully and likely more powerfully outdoors in direct experiential relation to those places and to those beings. I put this picture in because it's the most inspiring picture I have of outdoor learning. And this is from a Students on Ice program that takes kids to the Arctic. And this was a pretty unbelievable day, but it's hopefully a source of inspiration for you to take some people, whatever their ages are, outside and sit in a circle. As I enter into the last recommendation, I want to show you an image that's a metaphor for the interconnectedness of knowledge. There's no sound here. It's just going to be a moving image. When I embarked on the work that I've done with my research group, SSHEAN, I knew that there were other scholars and teachers and elders out there who had thought about these things much before me, and on whose strengths and resources I could draw to create something like a visible mushroom, a chanterelle mushroom at the top that we were hoping would be produced from our work. So I wanted to explore the mycelial network beneath the surface. And I was able to do a number of interviews with people, which I unfortunately don't have time to summarize today, but I do want to show my gratitude to everyone who participated in that. So I looked to speak with people who were in the areas of Indigenous studies, environmental education, environmental history, and social studies, with a number of other offshoots, as you can see depicted here. So I want you to invite yourself to see yourself as the chanterelle mushroom at the top, and to imagine what network is beneath the ground on which you walk that you can tap into and learn from and work with. This is my uncovering the mycelial network metaphor. So I suggest to you, don't start from scratch. Don't go it alone. That will be lonely. Don't do anything lonely. We're lonely enough, right? Don't do anything draining. We're drained enough. So go to the folks who are out there already doing it and join them. And this is the advice I give to young people and the teacher candidates I teach too about environmental action. You don't have to start anything on your own. Just find somebody to join with, right? Look to invite guest speakers from, local community gardening or food sovereignty projects or conservation areas. They carry histories of how they got started, or the need that led to the development of their organization, or climate action organizations in your community. Get them to develop a history for you of how they grew and built together. Access regional conservation areas who have education leads. They're often very knowledgeable and can support history teachers. Archivists, of course, and librarians and libraries with environmental collections, or accessing primary sources that can support environmental inquiries and primary source activities. Check out your favorite environmental history book that's written for an adult audience or an academic audience, and let it become the basis for a K-12 teaching lesson. There are so many amazing environmental historians in Canada. There's so much incredible work going on in that field. And yet, we're still having trouble, I think, making it easily accessible to teachers in K-12 classrooms. And so that's what sort of an example we tried to show with SHEAN's War Junk Lesson, which is a wonderful book written by Alex Sushin. And I'm quite proud of showing, what I think is possible if we could work more often with the great research that our environmental historians in Canada are doing. And then lastly, learn with and from your students, or from and with your students, because it's totally fine to need to do that that uncovering of the mycelial network with your students and get them involved and do some community engaged projects and make it more active for everyone.